Coming up next, the Gravity North. Coming up next, Vampire Hunter. Coming up next, Caillou. Coming up next, Samurai Gladys. Coming up next, Flapjack Guppies. Coming up next, Pandora's Box. Coming up next, Chowder Guppies. Coming up next, Professor Kimberly. Coming up next, Mr. Magoo. Coming up next, Mrs. Much More. Coming up next, The Grim Adventures of Puddin' and Mindy. Coming up next, Summer Camp Gladys. Coming up next, The Grim Adventures of Flapjack and Chowder. Coming up next, Summer Camp Camp Camp. Coming up next, Mr. Cat. Coming up next, Duncan. Coming up next, Bentley. Coming up next, Rocco. Coming up next, Forsyth. Coming up next, Morsyth. Coming up next, Benicos. Coming up next, Weasel. Coming up next, Wallace. Coming up next, Aggie. Coming up next, Steven. Coming up next, Kyo. Coming up next, Fizz. Coming up next, Taffy. Coming up next, Snap. Coming up next, Happy. Coming up next, Fizz. Coming up next, Taffy. Coming up next, Snap. Coming up next, Happy. Coming up next, Benjamin Guppies. Coming up next, Professor Knight. Coming up next, Benjamin Guppies. Coming up next, Professor Knight.